The snow had been falling since before 3 in the morning, quiet and relentless, the kind that muffled everything in Brampton until the whole city felt like it was holding its breath. On the 14th floor of Hartwell Financial Group's head office, where portfolio managers usually arrived smelling of dark roast and pressed wool, only one person was already there when the lights in the stairwell clicked on automatically at 5:47 a.m. Thomas Greer pushing a cleaning cart around the corner of the open-plan floor, one hand on the handle, the other pulling his collar tighter against the draft that slipped through the old window seals every January without fail. He moved the way people move when they have learned to take up as little space as possible. Not out of shame, exactly, but out of practice. His boots were dry but worn at the toe. His Hartwell ID badge, clipped sideways to his chest, said facilities staff, and the laminate had cracked at the corner from 3 winters of the same cold. He had been up since 2. His daughter Cora, who was 7 and had her mother's stubbornness and her grandmother's laugh, had woken with a fever that came and went like weather. Thomas had sat on the edge of her bed with a damp cloth until she fell back asleep sometime around 4, one small hand wrapped around 2 of his fingers even after her eyes closed. He had written a note for the neighbor who watched her on early mornings, left it under the kitchen magnet shaped like a maple leaf, and driven through empty streets to make his shift. None of this was visible on his face. He had learned how to carry exhaustion without advertising it. Above him, through the glass partition that separated the floor's main corridor from the executive suite, voices had been rising for 20 minutes. Thomas could not make out words, only tone. And the tone was the kind that meant something had already gone badly wrong and people were now deciding who to blame for it. He had heard that tone before in warehouses, in hospital hallways, in the apartment above his when his marriage was ending. He recognized it the way you recognize a smell that belongs to a specific kind of trouble. He kept moving. Glass partition, cartwheels, the soft sound of the vacuum's extension cord dragging across the floor tile. Then one of the executive suite doors swung open harder than intended, and a junior analyst rushed out carrying a printed spreadsheet binder, moving fast enough that she clipped the edge of a standing plant near the reception desk and didn't stop to check it. The binder slipped from under her arm. Pages scattered. She gathered most of them quickly, tucked them back without checking the order, and was already gone down the stairwell before the elevator arrived. One page had floated wide. It landed half-folded near the base of Thomas's cart, face up under the fluorescent light. He should have left it. Loose documents on this floor were none of his business, and he knew it, had known it since his first week 3 years ago when a supervisor told him plainly that the 14th floor operated under confidentiality protocols, and that meant eyes forward and ears closed. But a single number on that page stopped him before the thought of walking away was fully formed. Not the number itself, exactly. The relationship between 2 numbers. A reserve allocation figure sitting in the wrong proportion to the liability column beside it. The kind of error that looked like rounding until you understood what the 2 figures were actually measuring. And then it looked like something else entirely. Thomas stared at it for 4 seconds. Maybe 5. Inside the executive suite, through the glass, he could see the Hartwell Financial Group's board of directors seated around the long oak table that had been there since the building opened in 1987. At the head sat Catherine Aldridge, the firm's CEO, who had taken over from her father 11 years ago and had spent most of those 11 years proving she hadn't needed his name to earn the chair. She was holding a document with both hands, not reading it anymore, just holding it the way you hold something you have already decided about. The document, Thomas would learn later, was the voluntary receivership filing. Hartwell's largest institutional client had withdrawn 3 weeks ago. A credit facility had been called early. 2 rounds of emergency talks with potential buyers had collapsed over the weekend. The filing was ready. The signatures were nearly there. Thomas looked at the page near his cart again, then at the room, then back at the page. He picked it up. He was still holding it when he pushed open the executive suite door. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. Every person at that table turned at once, and the turning itself had the quality of something mechanical. Synchronized, involuntary. A man in a charcoal suit near the window actually flinched, as though a piece of furniture had addressed him. Thomas stood in the doorway in his facility's staff jacket, cart still in the corridor behind him, the loose page held carefully in both hands. He was aware of exactly how this looked. He had spent 3 years being looked through by people on this floor, and now every one of them was looking directly at him, and none of the looking felt kind. Catherine Aldridge did not flinch. She set the receivership filing down flat on the table and waited. The man closest to the door, stocky, silver-haired, the kind of deliberate stillness that came from decades of boardroom practice, leaned forward in his chair. His name, Thomas would later learn, was Stuart Colquhoun, and he was Hartwell's chief risk officer, and he had been in that chair for 19 years. "This floor is restricted," Stuart said. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. Who authorized access? Thomas did not step back. His heart was doing something uncomfortable behind his ribs, but his voice, when it came, was level. "I'm sorry to interrupt." He held the page up slightly. "I think there may be an error in this document in the reserve schedule." Someone at the far end of the table exhaled sharply. Not quite a laugh, but the shape of one. Stuart's expression did not shift. "You clean the floors." "Yes," Thomas said. "But this allocation figure, the deferred loss reserve on the credit facility, I don't think it matches your actual exposure if the covenant trigger was already partially exercised in Q3. The room held. Catherine Aldridge had not looked away from him once. "Come here," she said. Stuart turned toward her. "Catherine, come here," she said again to Thomas. He walked the length of the room, aware of his boots on the hardwood, aware of the cleaning solution smell that had followed him in, aware of 11 people watching him approach the table as though he had stepped out of a wall. He placed the page on the table near Catherine's hand and pointed to the line. "This figure assumes the reserve draws down against total facility exposure. But if the Q3 partial trigger was exercised, your net exposure already shifted here." He moved his finger to the column beside it. "This number doesn't reflect that. It's still calculating against the pre-trigger balance." Stuart leaned forward immediately. "That's standard treatment under the original covenant structure." "Yes," Thomas said quietly. "But not after partial exercise. The basis changes." Catherine picked up the page. She looked at it for a moment, then set it down and looked at the young analyst seated near the projector. "Run it," she said. The analyst blinked. "Ma'am, recalculate the reserve schedule assuming Q3 partial exercise already posted. Do it now." The analyst pulled her laptop closer. The room waited in a silence that had changed quality. Not hostile anymore, but suspended, like the moment before a weather report delivers the actual number. Thomas stood back from the table and tried not to think about Cora's fever or the form he was supposed to drop at her school by noon, or the fact that he had no idea whether he still had a job. Then the analyst stopped typing. She looked at her screen, then at Catherine, then at her screen again. "The reserve is overstated," she said. Her voice had gone careful the way voices do when they are carrying more than they expected, by approximately $31 million. Stuart sat up straight. "That's not possible." The analyst turned the laptop. "The model is pulling from the pre-amendment covenant schedule. If I correct the basis," she typed again, "net exposure drops significantly. We're not in covenant breach." Another analyst across the table leaned over. "Wait, run the liquidity ratio again with that figure." A third voice. "If the reserve is corrected, the receivership threshold isn't triggered." The room moved differently now. Not panic, something more like controlled alarm, the particular energy of people who have been preparing for one outcome and have just been handed the possibility of a different one. Catherine Aldridge rose from her chair. She walked around the table to the analyst's laptop herself and read the numbers without speaking. Then she looked up at Thomas. "How did you see that?" Thomas took a moment before answering, because the honest answer was not a simple one. "The two figures didn't belong to each other," he said finally. "When numbers are supposed to relate and they don't, it stays with me." Stuart made a sound that wasn't quite dismissive, but was working in that direction. "You read financial models." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation shaped like one. Thomas looked at him evenly. "Not usually." "Then what exactly are you telling us?" "I'm telling you that number looked wrong." Catherine was still watching him. She had the quality of someone who had learned to measure people by how they handled pressure from below, not just from above, and she was measuring him now with something that was not suspicion and not quite trust, but was somewhere between the two, moving steadily toward one side. "What's your name?" she asked. "Thomas Greer." "How long have you worked here?" 3 years. Stuart leaned back and let the silence say what he was choosing not to. Catherine ignored it. "And before that?" Thomas glanced once toward the window. Outside, snow was still falling, patient and indifferent the way Canadian winters fall, as though the cold has nowhere to be and all the time in the world. "Before that, I was in actuarial science," he said. "University of Waterloo. I was 2 years into my professional designation when my wife got sick." No one spoke. "She died when our daughter was 18 months old. After that, I took whatever work let me be home by 6. He left it there, not because the story was finished, but because the rest of it. The insurance bills, the night shifts, the years of watching his credentials expire like a passport he no longer had the money to renew, belonged to him in a way he wasn't ready to hand over to a boardroom full of strangers. Catherine did not fill the silence with condolence. She seemed to understand that he had not offered it as an invitation for sympathy. "Stay," she said simply. "If you saw one problem, you may see another." Stewart stood. "Catherine, this is completely—" "Sit down, Stewart." He sat. What happened over the next hour felt less like a board meeting and more like the controlled demolition of a story that someone had been telling this company for a very long time. Every 10 minutes, another analyst found something. A subordinated debt position that had been carried at par when it should have been marked to current market. A liquidity buffer that had been counted twice across two consolidated entities. A hedge position whose offsetting leg had been quietly unwound 3 months ago without being reflected in the summary risk report. None of them individually saved Hartwell Financial, but together they changed the shape of the crisis completely. From inevitable collapse to a problem with edges, a problem that could be argued with, a problem that had not yet won. Thomas remained standing near the wall. He helped when asked, pointed to things that caught him wrong, stayed quiet the rest of the time. At one point, his eyes drifted to the clock on the wall, and Catherine noticed. "Do you need to be somewhere?" she asked. "My daughter's school," he said. "Noon. She has a medical form." Stewart gave a short, impatient exhale. Catherine looked at her assistant through the glass wall and made a brief motion. "Call Creditview Elementary," she told her when the assistant stepped in. "Tell them Cora Greer's form is delayed and the office is aware." Thomas looked at her. "You don't have to do that." "I know," she said. Stewart folded his arms. "We're not running a daycare service in the middle of a financial crisis." Catherine answered without looking at him. "We're correcting our priorities." It was around that point that Thomas noticed something in the timestamps on the amended model files. He was not looking for it. He was helping the junior analyst cross-reference the hedge position records. But the pattern emerged the same way the first error had. Quietly, insistently, like a sound at the wrong frequency. The documents had been revised. Not once. Repeatedly across several versions, always late at night, always under the same set of credentials. He said nothing immediately. He waited until the analyst had moved to a different file, then looked again. The earliest version of the model, the one filed internally 8 months ago, showed healthier figures, substantially healthier. The reserve overstatement had not always been there. It had been introduced methodically over several revision cycles in a way that was designed to look like conservative adjustment. "This model was changed after the original," Thomas said quietly. The analyst looked up. Thomas pointed to the version history. "These values were correct in the first draft. Someone overwrote them." The analyst's face changed. "Whose login?" Catherine asked from across the table. The analyst checked the metadata, then checked it again. "Stuart Colhoun," she said. "All 6 edits." The room went very still. Stewart unfolded his arms slowly. "Final model revisions go through my office. That's standard governance." "At 1 a.m.? Catherine said. "Risk review doesn't keep business hours." 3 separate nights, the analyst said, voice careful now. "Always between midnight and 2. Catherine looked at Stewart with an expression that had shed every layer of professional courtesy. "The original figures showed Hartwell was not in breach," she said. "It was not a question." Stewart said nothing. "Someone made it look like we were." Still not a question. The silence that followed was the kind that answers. Another analyst spoke from the far end. "There are external transfers as well." She 4 payments over 6 months. Routed through a numbered company in Alberta. Listed as strategic advisory fees. "Advisory for what?" Catherine asked. "No deliverables attached. How much?" "Combined total $6.4 million. Stewart's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Thomas saw it. Catherine saw it too. "Pull the corporate registration," Catherine said. The analyst typed, "Registered 14 months ago. Sole director listed as a nominee." She paused. "Registered address matches the law firm that handles receivership filings for Dominion Capital acquisitions." The name landed in the room like cold air through an open door. Dominion Capital had been one of the 2 buyers whose offer had collapsed over the weekend. They had walked away citing unacceptable risk exposure. The same risk exposure now sitting on screen in front of everyone, artificially constructed, carefully timed. "They weren't walking away from a bad deal," Catherine said slowly. "They were waiting for us to get cheap enough." No one answered, because the numbers had already answered. Catherine pressed the intercom. "Get legal up here now." She looked at Stewart. "You don't speak until counsel is present." Stewart's composure had been eroding in small increments for the past 20 minutes. Now he tried to recover it, pulling himself straight, attempting the measured tone of a man who still believed he could talk his way back to solid ground. "You're overreacting," he said. "Models get conservative in distress scenarios. Advisors are paid for optionality. This is a creative reading of routine governance. $6 million of routine governance," Catherine said. "Ava." He caught himself. Catherine, think about what you're doing. Dominion is still the most credible exit option this firm has. If you torch that relationship on the word of. He glanced toward Thomas, and the glance contained everything he hadn't said aloud. On the basis of a preliminary review, you will not find another buyer before the credit line expires. Then we don't find another buyer, Catherine said. We fix what was broken and we fight. With what runway? With the runway that actually exists, not the one someone built for us. Stewart was quiet for a moment. Then, softer, your father would have taken the deal. Catherine's expression did not move, but something behind it did. My father, she said, never had $6.4 million transferred to a company that didn't exist. Legal arrived 7 minutes later. 2 counsel, a compliance officer, and the firm's external auditor who happened to be in the building for an unrelated review. What followed was swift and procedural in the way that things become swift and procedural when the documentation is already on screen and the room full of witnesses. Stuart Colquhoun was asked to accompany compliance to a separate office. He went without further argument, which told Catherine more than any further argument would have. Thomas moved back toward the wall while the lawyers settled. The crisis had not ended. There was still a damaged balance sheet, still nervous creditors, still a credit facility that needed restructuring, but the nature of the crisis had changed. It was a real problem now, not a manufactured one. Real problems, in Thomas's experience, were the kind you could actually work on. He was thinking about whether he could still make it to Cora's school before noon when Catherine appeared beside him. "Tell me something honestly," she said. She kept her voice low, away from the lawyers and analysts still working across the room. "Were you running from something? Before the cleaning work?" Thomas recognized the question for what it was, not an accusation but an attempt to understand how a person ends up somewhere like this, doing work like this, while carrying whatever he was clearly carrying. "I was running toward something," he said. "Cora needed me present, not successful. Present." Catherine looked at him for a moment without speaking. Outside, the snow had eased into something lighter, a scatter of flakes rather than a fall, the kind that catches in your eyelashes and doesn't last. "There's a position," she said. "Risk systems review. It's not flashy. It's reading models and finding the things that don't belong." Thomas almost said no immediately, which was his reflex, the one built from 3 years of being careful about wanting things he couldn't protect. "My daughter gets picked up at 3:15, he said instead. "Every day. Non-negotiable. Then 3:15 is non-negotiable. She gets sick sometimes. Stomach things, ear things. I leave when the school calls." "You leave when the school calls." Thomas looked her steadily, checking whether the agreement was real or the kind that dissolves the first time it becomes inconvenient. Catherine held his gaze without blinking. "The dental plan for support staff," he said. "It hasn't been updated in 8 years. The coverage ceiling doesn't match actual cost anywhere in Ontario." Catherine tilted her head slightly. "You want me to fix staff dental as a condition of your employment?" "I want you to fix it because it's wrong," Thomas said. "I'm just mentioning it while I have the chance." Something crossed Catherine's face that was not quite a smile, but was close enough that it changed the room slightly. "Done," she said. "And the night shift workers in the data center. They get cab reimbursement that doesn't cover actual fares anymore. It was set in 2016. Also done." Thomas nodded once. He picked up the folder she had set beside him and did not open it yet. Some decisions needed a moment to settle before they became real. The hostile intervention from Dominion Capital came at 2 in the afternoon, not through the boardroom door, but through a formal notice delivered to legal by courier, demanding an emergency creditor meeting under receivership provisions. It arrived 40 minutes after Stewart had been escorted to the compliance office, which meant the timing was not coincidental. What followed was 4 hours of compressed, grinding work that felt like a different kind of running. Counsel prepared documentation packages. The auditor certified corrected figures. Catherine and her remaining senior team rebuilt the liquidity narrative from scratch, this time using real numbers, and the real numbers, while not comfortable, were survivable. Not thriving, not clean, but survivable, which was a different thing entirely from the story that had been told in that boardroom since October. Thomas stayed. He was asked to verify 2 more model sections and found a third problem on his own. A foreign exchange hedge that had been reported as active, but whose confirmation receipts didn't match the counterparty records. It was smaller than the others. It mattered anyway. At one point, one of the younger analysts, a woman named Priya, who had been working for 12 straight hours and whose careful professionalism was starting to show its seams, looked up from her laptop and said, "How do you do that? Just look at a number and know." Thomas considered the question. "I don't know the number is wrong," he said. "I know it doesn't fit with the number beside it. That's different. But how do you hold all of it in your head at once? He thought about Cora's homework spread across the kitchen table, about the way he had started explaining math to her, not as a subject, but as a way of noticing when things didn't add up, and how she had recently told her teacher that numbers were like puzzles, where the missing piece was hiding in plain sight. Practice, he said, and paying attention to things other people have decided aren't worth their time. Priya looked back at her screen. I'm going to remember that, she said quietly, more to herself than to him. The creditor meeting with Dominion Capital's representatives began at 4:30. Thomas was not in the room for that part. He was in the small glass-walled office at the end of the floor, going through the corrected models one final time with the auditor when his phone buzzed. The neighbor. Cora had woken up from her afternoon nap with her fever gone, but asking for him in the specific plaintive way that meant she was fine but wanted her dad. He texted back, on my way in an hour. Tell her I said her fever lost. The auditor looked up. Everything okay? My daughter, Thomas said. She'll be fine. You can go. We've got what we need. 10 more minutes, Thomas said. There's one more linked table I want to check. There was. He found a small but consequential error in the hedge documentation. A settlement date misrecorded by 1/4, and flagged it before he stood, put on his jacket, and walked back to the main floor to collect his cart from the corridor where he had left it 8 hours ago. The cart was still there. Someone had pushed it neatly against the wall and put a post-it note on the handle that said thank you in what was clearly rushed handwriting. He pulled the note off, folded it, and put it in his pocket, not because he would keep it, because it seemed like the right thing to do for now. Catherine found him in the corridor before he reached the elevator. Dominion backed down, she said. Their legal position doesn't hold without the distressed figures. Our counsel made that clear. Thomas nodded. Stewart has retained a criminal defense lawyer, she added, which tells us what we needed to know about how cooperative he intends to be. And Hartwell? Alive, Catherine said. For now. Which is more than it was at 5 this morning. She handed him a card. His name was already printed on it. She or someone had prepared it while he was in with the auditor. Thomas Greer, Risk Systems Advisor, the Hartwell logo in the top left corner, a phone extension. He turned it over once in his hands. The dental plan review, Catherine said. I've already asked HR to start the process, and the cab reimbursement. Those aren't contingent on whether you accept the position. I know, he said. I'm fixing them because they're wrong, she said, and she said it in the same tone he had used, which was deliberate and which he recognized. He put the card in his pocket next to the post-it note. I'll let you know by Friday, he said. The elevator came. He took his card in with him. There was still a supply closet on the 3rd floor that needed restocking before the end of his shift, and he was not the kind of person who left things unfinished because something unexpected had happened. The lobby was quieter than the morning. The security desk officer nodded when he passed. Outside, the snow had stopped. The parking lot was sheeted in white that had gone hard and crystalline in the cold, catching the last of the afternoon light in a way that made the whole surface look briefly silver. Across the street, Cora was standing on the neighbor's porch in her purple coat, which was too thin for January, but which she refused to trade for the warmer one, because she had explained with great seriousness it had a pocket shaped like a heart, and that was more important than warmth. She saw him the moment he came through the door, and her face did the thing it always did, lit up, and then immediately arranged itself into the expression of someone who had been extremely patient and needed him to know it. You're very late, she informed him. I know. He crossed toward her and crouched down to her level, checking her forehead out of habit. Cool. Big day at work. Did you fix something? He adjusted the zipper on her coat, the one that always stuck partway. Something like that. Was it hard? He thought about the boardroom at dawn, the scattered pages, the number that had refused to let him walk away, the 11 people staring at him as though he had stepped out of a wall. It was just one number, he said, and then another one. Cora considered this with the focused seriousness she applied to things she wasn't entirely sure she believed. Okay, she said finally, in the tone that meant she was accepting his answer provisionally and would return to it later. He took her hand, and they walked to the car through snow that squeaked under their boots the way it only does when the temperature has dropped enough to make the crystals stack properly. The way his father had once explained to him on a morning not unlike this one, in a city not entirely unlike this one, when the world had felt very large and the problems in it had not yet become personal. 42 floors up, Catherine Aldridge was still at her desk. The unsigned receivership filing sat in the recycling bin beside the shredder. She had not shredded it, not yet. She was not sure why. Perhaps because it was useful to keep the shape of the almost disaster close enough to see, at least for a while. She stood at the window, watching the parking lot empty in the early dark of a Canadian January afternoon. She couldn't see Thomas and his daughter from this angle, didn't know which car was his, but she watched the last of the afternoon commuters pull out and head for the roads that led home, and she thought about what it costs a person to keep showing up to a place that has never learned to look at them, and what it says about a person that they show up anyway, and what it says about a building, a company, a board, a floor full of people in expensive suits, that it almost let everything collapse before it thought to pay attention to who had been standing right there the whole time. She turned back to her desk. There was still work to do. Real work this time, the kind built on numbers that meant what they said. That was enough to start with.